We are live on the Chef Girl Nutrition Facebook page with another live cooking demo Tuesday. Of course, we have Thanksgiving coming up in 2 days now, and thinking about how Thanksgiving might be different this year, and a lot of us are having smaller Thanksgiving gatherings. Maybe it's only 2 of you, 4 of you, whatever it is. Thinking of, when we're thinking of what we're going to make for Thanksgiving this year, we want to think of things that we can either make smaller portions of, things that are a little bit less time consuming because we don't necessarily need to spend the whole day in the kitchen like we do for a typical big Thanksgiving feast. And maybe we don't need so many different kinds of dishes, so many different side dishes, but we can kind of consolidate into a few dishes that gets our veggies in, gets our, sweet potato casseroles in, and all of our Thanksgiving favorites, but in a little bit of a condensed way. So thinking of that, one of the most simple kinds of dishes that you could make to get all of your veggies in for the meal is to make a big sheet tray of roasted veggies. So that's what we're going to talk about today, and that's what I'm going to demo for you. So a big sheet tray of veggies is great for a lot of reasons. So one, it's a way to get a bunch of different veggies in one go. So like I'm going to be working here today with all different sweet potatoes, beets, butternut squash, carrots, red potatoes, and a turnip. So we can get a lot of different vegetables in one dish. I'm doing, a big sheet tray like this. It's also, aside from just a bowl that I'm going to use to toss all of the veggies with our oil and salt and pepper and other spices and seasonings, we just need a cutting board and knife to chop up our veggies, a bowl to mix them, and then just a big baking sheet that you're going to cook them on. So everything gets cooked on one baking sheet, and that makes for easy prep and then even easier cleanup. Especially, like you just saw, I like to line the baking sheet with parchment paper because it's super non-stick, and so it's very easy cleanup. You just can, discard the parchment paper when it's done, when they're done cooking, and that's it. So it's a really great dish to get a bunch of different veggies in. It's simple. You can switch it up. It's very versatile, of course. You can switch up whatever kind of veggies you and your family like, and that's what you can use. And then something that we're going to talk about with the demo today is using different fresh and or dried herbs and spices to add some more flavor, and it's a way for you to add flavor that kind of balances with whatever the rest of your meal is. So in this case, we're talking about Thanksgiving. So I have here today fresh thyme and fresh rosemary, because those are 2 herbs that are very Thanksgiving-y. Those are kinds of flavors that remind us of Thanksgiving food. It's the kind of, herbs that you'll find in stuffings, and you might, rosemary and thyme are both considered poultry seasoning, so it's common herbs to be used for your turkey as well. So those flavors are typical fall herbs, so that's what we're going to use to flavor the veggies today. So for a typical just roasted veggie dish, there's a couple of tips that I'll point out as we go. So what I have here, what I showed you, all these different veggies that I have, they're all root vegetables, plus potatoes, which are technically tubers, but they kind of act like root vegetables. So the thing here is that all the different root vegetables, they're all very hardy. They're all very, they're firm and they're hardy, so they take a longer time to cook. So these will all cook at pretty even times as long as we cut them into as uniform sized pieces as we can. So whenever you're making a big sheet tray of roasted veggies, you want to pick vegetables that kind of cook at equal times. So whereas the root vegetables are going to take upwards of like 45 minutes, maybe even longer to roast, depends on how big you cut them. More non-starchy type vegetables like broccoli and cauliflower and peppers and all that kind of stuff will roast much more quickly. So that will only be like 20 to 25 minutes instead of like 45 minutes. So that's something to consider. And when we're talking about fall and our seasonal veggies, of course, we spoke about root vegetables with our root veggie mash a couple weeks ago. So these root vegetables are all in season for the fall, and they're all vegetables that kind of, scream Thanksgiving. So that's what we're doing here. The next point that I'm going to bring up is to peel or not to peel your vegetables. So it really depends. It's really up to you. Most vegetables you can eat the peel. Something like a turnip, it's a pretty, like this one's pretty smooth. It really kind of depends. Sometimes you'll get one that's more, that might be more rough, so you might not want to use it. Same thing with like the sweet potato. Sometimes they're more dirty, right? We've talked before with the root vegetables about how they're much dirtier than other veggies because they grow under the dirt. So usually a good, rinse and scrub, whether you're peeling or not, you want to rinse and scrub any root vegetables really well, even if you are going to peel them. And if you really can't get the dirt off of the peel, if they're really dirty, like sometimes the beets can be like covered in dirt, then you might want to consider peeling it if you can't get all the dirt off of there. Also, if you're buying organic versus not organic, if it's not organic, you might want to consider peeling versus if it is organic, there's less, risk of pesticides and things being on the skin. So that's something to consider. And then of course the flavor. So the peels of these, like the peel of the turnip is going to have that like spiciness that the turnip itself does, like a radish. So you might not like the flavor of the peel. Some potatoes, I love to use red potatoes because they have a very soft peel on them. So it's not like really chewy or anything like that. But it's really up to you. It's your preference. Certainly things like our butternut squash has a very tough outer peel. We really don't want to eat it. It's not really edible. So the butternut squash, I already peeled completely. But some other kinds of squash like acorn squash, delicata squash, those have a much more tender peel and you can eat it. So kind of play around, if there's something that you typically peel, you can try to not peel it, like carrots even, you technically don't need to peel them, just rinse and scrub them really well. So you can try peeled or not peeled and kind of learn what your preference is. But for the most part, it's optional. Okay, so let's get into chopping. So like I said, one of the important points here is that we want to chop everything into as even pieces as we can so that they cook evenly. So let's start with this butternut squash because it's gigantic. Move my beets. Okay, so the butternut squash, we've worked with butternut squash before. Like I said, I already peeled the whole thing. So I'm just gonna cut off the ends. And then you can either stand it up and cut it down lengthwise, or you can cut it crosswise to make two smaller halves, whatever you're more comfortable with. That. And that's what we get. And then with any squash like this, we're going to scoop out the seeds and chop it all up. So I just go right into, I use a metal spoon. The edge of the metal will help to really scrape those seeds out of there. Okay, so I'm going to start just with half of the squash because it's very big. We might not need all of it. Okay, so once we get all of our seeds out nice and clean, I'm going to just cut And so we're looking for like about 1 inch pieces. So something like this. Just nice cubed pieces. So again, depending on the size that you cut them, the bigger they are, the longer they'll take to cook. So generally like a 1 inch piece is a pretty good size. Okay, and then as I cut them, I'm just throwing them into my bowl. So it's a good way, have the bowl next to you to put them in where you're gonna mix everything up so that you can keep your cutting board clear, right? Rather than like having everything cut up on the corner of your cutting board, have the bowl right next to you. And they definitely don't need to be like perfect squares or anything. It's just more important that they're as close to equal size pieces as possible. Okay. So that's the squash. Like I said, I only use half of it for now because the next point that I'll make as we're, once we're getting ready to put it on the sheet tray, is we don't want to overcrowd the baking sheet. If the vegetables are overcrowded and overlapping and not laying flat on the baking sheet, they will more so steam than get nice and caramelized, right? So one of the reasons that we like to roast, which we've talked about before, is because we get a really nice natural caramelization on the vegetables. Especially a lot of these root vegetables like our sweet potatoes, the squashes, the carrots, they have a lot of natural sugars in them, so they caramelize really nicely when they're roasted. But if they are overlapping on the tray, they will steam instead of get that crispy caramelization. So they'll cook and they'll just kind of get soft instead of getting that brownness on them. So I don't want to cut up the whole butternut squash because we have a lot of other vegetables and it's going to be too much for the one sheet tray. So that's the other thing. If you have cut everything up and you realize you have too much for one sheet tray, just use 2. And that is the solution to that. Okay, so the next thing we can do our sweet potato. So I prefer, just like we were talking about peeling or not peeling, whenever I can, I prefer not to peel because the peel of vegetables is very nutrient dense. There's a lot of fiber in the peel. So whenever possible, I try to leave the peel on. So something like a sweet potato, you definitely want to rinse and scrub it really well if you're going to leave the peel on. Okay. So sweet potato, just cut off our ends. This guy's kind of like odd shaped, so I'm just going to cut it in half to make it a little bit easier. Okay. So again, now keeping my butternut squash here right next to me so I can see the size that I cut them and try to cut the sweet potato to be pretty equal size. So I'm going to cut this again. And that's it. So we have nice cubes, whoops, now of the sweet potato as well. And you can see how the way that I'm cutting these vegetables, Because the root vegetables are hardy and tough, it can be hard to cut into them sometimes. So I always am keeping my hand on top of the knife to help me, push the knife through gently. And so this is definitely something that you can make ahead of time. Even if I prefer the roasted vegetables fresh out of the oven, but they do reheat fine. Even if you didn't want to go through with cooking them fully, you could at least do the prep work of peeling and chopping and, have them in a bowl like this, or a sealed container that is in the fridge until Thursday. And then all you have to do is toss them with the olive oil and whatever spices and seasonings you're using and roast them. So it just takes pretty much all of the prep here is in the peeling and chopping. So if you get that step out of the way, that saves a lot of time. And this is just a great thing to do even just for, during the week. It's just a simple, a quick, simple way to cook up a bunch of veggies. It's great for meal prep because you can roast all these vegetables and then just have them cooked in your fridge all week, and you can kind of pick and choose what you want and toss them into different dishes throughout the week. But all the hard work is done for you. I recommend in between cutting any sort of potatoes, you rinse your knife off and get that starchiness off of the knife. Okay, I'm gonna do that. All right, then I have a couple of these red potatoes. So like I said, I'm leaving the peel on these as well. Just chopping them up. So these cut pretty easily. So you can see what I'm talking about with the potato. Like it just, right, it gets just stuck to the knife. So you just want to be careful of that. Okay, these are actually pretty big. And so the thyme and rosemary that we have here is very classic with potatoes. So you can do just rosemary roasted potatoes, and that would also just be a really good side dish on its own. And something else that you can do, if you're using a really big sheet tray, you can actually do two different things on one baking sheet. So if you wanted to just do rosemary roasted potatoes, you could keep those red potatoes on their own, mix them up with the olive oil, salt and pepper, and the rosemary, and keep them to one side of the baking sheet, and then mix up whatever other vegetables you're doing with different seasonings or whatever it is and put them on the other side of the baking sheet. So you can kind of get like two different roasted vegetable dishes almost, using the one tray as well. Okay, and then we have our carrots. So the carrots are a little bit different because they are shaped different, right? So we're not going to get the same kind of like cubed pieces that we're getting with the other vegetables. So we want to just cut them in rounds that are going to be close to the same size, right? So just cut them in. And once you get towards the skinnier side, they can be bigger pieces, right? Because like this, it's like this longer skinny piece is, equivalent to this shorter, wider piece. So you just kind of compensate. Like I said, it doesn't have to be perfect, but you just want to try to get the pieces to be as close to the same size as possible. then the turnip, I'm going to just cut the ends off. Ooh. Turnip is hard. Okay. Right, so same kind of deal as the potatoes. Okay, so all that's left is our beets. So we worked with beets, of course. We made roasted beets, but we made them whole, unpeeled, right? So we left them totally whole, wrapped them up in aluminum foil, and put them into the oven. So I had mentioned that an alternative way to roast them is to peel them first and chop them up and roast them in pieces. So that's what we're going to do here. So these are already peeled, rinsed and scrubbed really well, and then peeled. And I'm just cutting them into the same size pieces as our other veggies. So I'm using, I'd say a total of like 3 pounds of root vegetables. Yeah, that's another thing, you know, this is something that's really simple and delicious that, you know, doesn't take up a lot of your cooking time, but can just be some, you know, the kind of like healthy reprieve among all of the other Thanksgiving dishes. Just to have some vegetables at the table. Okay. All right, so that's it for chopping up our vegetables. I'm going to switch this out for our bowl. Okay, so we have the bowl full now of all of our chopped up veggies. So, I'm gonna get my baking sheet here. By the way, I have the oven preheated to 425. So when we're roasting veggies, we want to get that caramelization. So to get that, we want a high heat. That's what's going to make those sugars really come out and get that crispiness, get that browning on the vegetables. So we want no lower than 400. I usually do somewhere 400 or 425 for these root vegetables because they're so hearty. I like to do 425 for those. For some more like non-starchy veggies like broccoli, string beans, things like that, I might do 400. Okay, so we're going to drizzle, for all of these vegetables, probably about a 1/4 cup of oil. So you can use olive oil or avocado oil. You want to use some oil that can withstand the high heat of the oven. So we want to just get these really nicely coated, as you can see. So I'm just giving a nice glug of olive oil here. And then we're going to add a very fat pinch of salt, really about a teaspoon for all of this. And we can always add more, of course, as we're mixing it, and then some black pepper. So that's really like the base for roasting the vegetables is oil, salt, and pepper. And then whatever, like we said, whatever kind of flavors you want, you know, if you're trying to get them to go along with whatever your dish is, or you're trying to keep them, you know, seasonal. So we're going to use the fresh thyme and rosemary. So you can add in any kind of fresh or dried herbs and spices that you like. If you're doing a kind of like Mediterranean dish, you might want to add some dried oregano and basil. And so I'm just tossing these all together. Kind of have a lot in here. But it's really beautiful. That's why I especially love doing the root vegetables, because you get tons of different colors. Leaving the skin on the turnip, we get the nice purple from the turnip. We have the red potatoes, the beets, the orange. Whoops. Okay. So once that's all mixed together, so you want the vegetables, and I'll show you in a second here. You want the vegetables to be really well coated with the oil. You don't want there to be like a pool of oil at the bottom of the tray, but you don't want any of the veggies to look dry. So you want them to be nicely coated. I have too much here for this for this one tray, so I'll show you. This is what I'm talking about here. So you can see I have like a big mound here in the middle, so I can't get them all to lay flat. So I'm going to want to grab a second baking sheet. So I'm just going to scoop some of these guys off here, because we want to get everything to be laying flat. Okay. Too much. Okay. And then with our herbs, so I love to use fresh thyme and rosemary, because they're hardy herbs, so they can also withstand the heat. So some other herbs, you know, fresh herbs like fresh basil, cilantro, parsley, things like that, that are really delicate, they can't really, those we like to add in more towards the end of cooking something, or, you know, to finish, to be like a garnish. But something like thyme and rosemary, they can withstand the heat. So they can go in earlier, on the cooking time. So we're gonna just put fresh thyme and fresh rosemary sprigs right on the tray here. It's nice and beautiful. Looks like fall. Okay. So you can either chop up the rosemary and thyme and then mix it in with the veggies, or like I said, and what I like to do is to I just kind of break the sprigs in half and just lay them all throughout the tray, and the flavor will just really start to infuse in there as they cook. And when we're roasting veggies, we're gonna always toss them halfway through cooking so that they get evenly, you know, caramelized. They get a chance to kind of brown on different sides. So we'll get to kind of toss the herbs around as well and flavor all of them. Okay, put a little bit more of the rosemary there. Okay. And then we're going to do the same thing with the thyme. So again, you can just mix the thyme leaves themselves, you know, take the thyme leaves off the branches and mix them in, or just lay some sprigs of thyme all throughout here. And so thyme is going to have, to me, thyme has more of a mild flavor than the rosemary, but they balance really well together. So I like to do them both. Another way that you can add flavor to something like this is to put some garlic cloves in here and get some roasted garlic. You could chop up some onion, just like big chunks of onion, and put those in here too, because we know garlic and onion create a lot of flavor, so that's something else that you can do. Okay, so it's kind of hard to see, but that's it. So they're all laid out nicely. We have the herbs all nice and tucked in there. So this is gonna go into the oven now. It's gonna go in for like 30 minutes, like 25 to 30 minutes to start. Pull them out and give everything a good shake. Make sure they're laying flat again before you put them back in the oven, and put it back in the oven for another like 15 to 20 minutes or so. Again, the timing depends on how big your pieces are, so just keep an eye on it, but you want them to be nice and tender. They should be getting caramelized, they should be getting browned, but it's really also, you know, it's up to you when you want to pull them out, you know, whatever, however, you know, however soft you want them to get, however, you know, browned you want them to get, but somewhere around the 45-minute mark, they should be pretty good to go. So I'm going to put these in. And that's it for our roasted root veggies.